You know that feeling when your entire world shifts in the span of 30 seconds? When everything you thought you knew about coincidence, fate, and second chances gets turned completely upside down. Well, let me tell you about the night that changed everything for me and my daughter Emma. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make your subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus, and 3 months ago, I was just another single dad trying to make ends meet in the small town of Cedar Falls. Every morning started the same way, Emma shaking me awake at 6:30 because she was too excited about her day to sleep any longer. At 7 years old, she had this incredible ability to find joy in everything, even when our little apartment felt like it was closing in on us. Being a paramedic in a town of 12,000 people meant that everyone knew your business, and everyone definitely knew mine. They knew that Emma's mom had left when she was just 2, disappearing one Tuesday morning with nothing but a note saying she wasn't ready to be a mother. They knew I'd been working double shifts to afford Emma's after-school program because my sister Sarah, who used to watch her, had moved to Portland for a teaching job. Most importantly, they knew that Central Valley Emergency Services, the ambulance company I'd worked for the past 8 years, was hemorrhaging money and laying people off left and right. I'd watched 12 of my colleagues get their pink slips in the past 6 months. Good people, experienced medics who knew these streets like the back of their hands, suddenly finding themselves scrambling for work in neighboring counties. The writing was on the wall, and my name was probably next on the list. The thought kept me awake most nights, staring at the ceiling and calculating how long our savings would last if I lost my job. Emma didn't know about any of this, of course. In her world, Daddy was a superhero who drove the ambulance with the flashing lights and helped people feel better. She'd draw pictures of me in my uniform, always with a giant smile and a stethoscope that looked more like a snake wrapped around my neck. Those drawings were taped all over our refrigerator, reminding me every morning why I had to keep going, why giving up wasn't an option. That particular Friday evening, Emma had been invited to a sleepover at her best friend Mia's house. It was the first time in months that I'd had a completely free night, no emergency calls, no overtime shifts, just me and whatever leftovers were hiding in the back of our fridge. But sitting alone in our quiet apartment felt more suffocating than peaceful, so I decided to treat myself to dinner at Romano's, the little Italian place downtown that Emma and I always talked about going to, but never could quite afford. Romano's wasn't fancy by any stretch of the imagination. Red checkered tablecloths, wine bottles turned into candle holders, and the kind of atmosphere that made you feel like you were eating in someone's grandmother's dining room. I'd driven past it hundreds of times during calls, always promising myself that someday, when things were better, Emma and I would have our fancy dinner there. I ordered the cheapest pasta on the menu and nursed a single beer, trying to make the evening last as long as possible. There's something both liberating and terrifying about being completely alone with your thoughts when you're used to constant chaos. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't rushing to pick up Emma, wasn't responding to emergency calls, wasn't worrying about whether she'd eaten enough vegetables or finished her homework. It was just me, my thoughts, and the gentle hum of conversation from the other diners around me. The restaurant was unusually busy for a Friday night in Cedar Falls. Most of the tables were occupied by couples on date nights or families celebrating something special. In the corner booth near the window, I noticed a woman dining alone, probably in her mid-40s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun and the kind of confident posture that suggested she was comfortable in her own company. She was dressed professionally, even for a casual dinner, in a navy blazer that looked expensive and well-tailored. Something about her seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. In a town this size, you tend to recognize faces even if you don't know names, but this felt different. There was something about the way she carried herself, The way she seemed to survey the room occasionally while she ate, that suggested she wasn't just another local resident. Having dinner. I was halfway through my linguine when the peaceful evening took a dramatic turn. The woman in the corner booth had been taking a sip of water when suddenly, she began coughing violently. At first, it looked like she might have just swallowed. Wrong, the kind of thing that happens to everyone when water goes down the wrong pipe. But within seconds, her coughing became more desperate, more panicked. Her hands flew to her throat, and I could see the unmistakable look of terror in her eyes. She was choking and choking badly. The piece of bread she'd been eating was lodged somewhere it shouldn't be, and her airway was completely blocked. Her face was already beginning to change color, that telltale sign that oxygen wasn't reaching her lungs. For a split second, the entire restaurant seemed frozen in time. Other diners had noticed something was wrong, but that moment of confusion and uncertainty hung in the air like a heavy fog. People were looking around at each other, wondering if they should do something, hoping someone else would know what to do, but I didn't have the luxury of hesitation. 8 years of emergency medical training had programmed my response into muscle memory. Before my conscious mind had even fully processed what was happening, I was already moving, my chair scraping against the floor as I stood up and rushed toward her table. Training took over completely. I approached her from behind, wrapping my arms around her waist and positioning my hands just below her rib cage. The Heimlich maneuver isn't as gentle as people imagine it to be in the movies. You have to apply real force, real pressure, because someone's life literally depends on dislodging whatever is blocking their airway. The first thrust didn't work, neither did the second. I could feel her body becoming weaker, her struggles becoming less coordinated as the lack of oxygen began taking its toll. The room around us had gone completely silent except for the sound of her desperate attempts to breathe. Everyone was watching, holding their collective breath, waiting to see if this would end in tragedy or triumph. On the third thrust, I felt something give way. The piece of bread shot out of her throat and landed on the floor beside our table with a small, almost anticlimactic thud. She immediately began gasping, drawing in huge, grateful breaths of air while doubling over and coughing. Her color slowly returned to normal, and the terrifying blue tinge around her lips faded away. The entire restaurant erupted in relieved applause, but I barely heard it. I was focused entirely on making sure she was okay, checking her pulse, asking if she felt dizzy or nauseous, running through the standard post-emergency protocols that had become second nature to me. She was shaking, understandably so, but her breathing was steady and her pulse was strong. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still hoarse from the ordeal. "You saved my life." I helped her back into her chair and asked the waitress to bring her some water. "Just doing my job," I replied, though technically, I wasn't on duty and this wasn't exactly a typical workplace scenario. "Are you feeling okay? Do you want me to call for an ambulance to check you out properly?" She shook her head, managing a weak smile. "I think I'm fine, thanks to you. You clearly know what you're doing. Are you a doctor?" "Paramedic," I answered. "Marcus Chun, with Central Valley Emergency Services." The moment I said the name of my company, something changed in her expression. It was subtle, just a slight shift in her eyes, but unmistakable. She knew something about Central Valley Emergency Services that I didn't expect a random diner to know. "Central Valley Emergency Services," she repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "That's interesting." Before I could ask what she meant by that, she extended her hand toward me. Her grip was firm despite everything that had just happened, and there was something in her eyes that suggested this chance encounter was about to become much more significant than either of us had initially realized. "I'm Victoria Marsh," she said, and immediately I understood why her face had seemed familiar. Victoria Marsh wasn't just anyone. She was the CEO of Apex Medical Solutions, the large corporate ambulance service that had been quietly buying up smaller companies throughout the region. I'd seen her picture in the local business journal just a few weeks earlier, in an article about the changing landscape of emergency medical services in rural communities. And more importantly, she was the person who would ultimately decide whether Central Valley Emergency Services would survive or become another acquisition casualty. The silence between us stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Victoria Marsh, the woman whose reputation preceded her throughout every small emergency medical service in a 300-mile radius, was sitting across from me with water still dripping from her chin, very much alive because of my intervention. The irony wasn't lost on me that I just saved the life of the person who might sign the papers that would end my career. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Her voice had regained its strength, but there was something different about her demeanor now. The corporate executive facade seemed to have cracked slightly, revealing something more human underneath. "I think we need to talk." I hesitated for a moment. Part of me wanted to politely excuse myself, to maintain the professional distance. That seemed appropriate given our positions. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself sliding into the seat across from her. The restaurant around us had gradually returned to its normal buzz of conversation, though I could still feel occasional glances from other diners who recognized me from my frequent emergency calls around town. "I have to admit," Victoria began, reaching for her water glass with hands that were still slightly trembling, "this isn't how I expected my evening to go. I'm in town for a few days, doing some research on local emergency services, and I thought I'd grab a quiet dinner before my meeting's tomorrow." Research on local emergency services. The phrase sent a chill down my spine. Everyone in the industry knew what that meant when it came from someone like Victoria Marsh. It meant evaluations, assessments, and ultimately, decisions about which companies were worth keeping and which ones were expendable. "I suppose you know why I'm here," she continued, reading the expression on my face. "Apex has been looking at Central Valley Emergency Services for several months now. Your financial reports, response times, patient satisfaction scores, staffing levels, all the numbers that determine whether a company is viable in today's healthcare landscape." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. This conversation was surreal enough without me saying something that might make it worse for my colleagues. "And me. What I didn't expect," she said, taking another careful sip of water, "was to experience your services firsthand. And I certainly didn't expect to owe my life to one of your paramedics." There was something in her tone that I couldn't quite read. It wasn't gratitude, exactly, though that was certainly there. It was more like surprise, as if she'd discovered something that didn't match her previous assumptions. "Can I ask you something, Marcus?" she said, and I noticed she was using my first name now, which felt strange coming from someone whose signature would likely determine my professional future. "How long have you been with Central Valley?" 8 years, I replied. "Started right after I finished my paramedic certification." "Emma was barely walking then." "Emma's your daughter?" "My everything," I said without thinking, then immediately worried that might sound unprofessional. But Victoria's expression softened rather than hardened. "Being a single parent in this field can't be easy," she observed. "The irregular hours, the emotional toll, the physical demands. How do you manage it all?" It was an unexpected question from someone I'd expected to be all business. I found myself telling her about Emma's drawings on our refrigerator, about how she'd learned to set her own alarm clock because sometimes my shifts ran long, about the way she'd greet me at the door with a hug that could wash away even the worst calls I'd had during the day. "She wants to be a paramedic too when she grows up," I admitted. Though last week she also wanted to be a professional ice cream taster, so we'll see how that evolves. Victoria actually laughed at that, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did me. Kids have a way of keeping things in perspective, don't they? As we talked, I began to see glimpses of the person behind the corporate title. She told me about her own daughter, now 25 and working as a nurse in Seattle. About how she'd missed too many school plays and soccer games while building her career, and how she sometimes wondered if the success had been worth the sacrifices. I didn't always work for a large corporation, she revealed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 20 years ago, I was running a small ambulance service in rural Montana. 3 trucks, 8 employees, and more heart than budget. I loved that job more than anything I've done since. What happened to it? I asked. Sold it to a larger company when my ex-husband got transferred for his job. Biggest mistake I ever made. They gutted it within 2 years, laid off most of the staff, consolidated routes. The community lost something irreplaceable, and I learned a hard lesson about the difference between running a business and serving the community. She was quiet for a moment, seemingly lost in memories that weren't entirely pleasant. Then she looked directly at me with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. "Tell me about your calls," she said. "Not the statistics or response times that are in your reports. Tell me about the people." So I did. I told her about Mrs. Patterson, the 83-year-old woman who called us at least once a month, usually for minor issues, but really because she was lonely and we were the only people who checked on her regularly. About the teenage boy we'd saved from an overdose last spring, who now volunteers at the community center and sends me updates about his college applications. About the car accident victims we'd pulled from a wreck during the ice storm in January. How we'd stayed with them for 2 hours until the roads were clear enough for transport. How one of them had named her newborn son after me 6 months later. "These aren't just statistics to you," Victoria observed. It wasn't really a question. "No," I replied. "They're neighbors. They're Emma's teachers and the librarian who reads to her on Thursday afternoons, and the mechanic who fixes my truck and doesn't charge me labor because he knows I'm always helping people. When you work in a community this size, every call matters because every person matters." Victoria was taking notes now, which made me nervous until I realized she wasn't writing down anything that could be used against Central Valley. Instead, she seemed to be jotting down thoughts, observations, questions that had nothing to do with profit margins or efficiency metrics. "Your company's financial situation is pretty dire," she said eventually, and the corporate executive had returned to her voice. "Revenue down 30% over the past 2 years, aging equipment, difficulty retaining staff. From a purely business perspective, acquisition makes sense for everyone involved." My heart sank. This was the conversation I'd been dreading. The inevitable conclusion that everyone at Central Valley had seen coming. "But," she continued, and that single word made me look up sharply, "there are things that don't show up in financial reports. Things like institutional knowledge, community relationships, and the kind of dedication that makes someone risk their own safety to save a complete stranger in a restaurant." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder that I recognized as Central Valley's evaluation packet. Inside were months of data, analysis, and recommendations that would determine our fate. "I came here with my mind made up," she admitted. "The numbers don't lie, and from a corporate standpoint, this should be a straightforward decision. But tonight has given me a lot to think about." She closed the folder and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Marcus, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If you could change anything about Central Valley Emergency Services, if you could fix any problem or implement any solution without worrying about budget constraints, what would you do?" It was the kind of question that could either save us or doom us, depending on how I answered. I thought about Emma's drawings, about my colleagues who were already updating their resumes, about Mrs. Patterson and all the other people who depended on us being there when they needed help. "We need newer equipment," I began carefully, "but more than that, We need to find ways to serve the community better while still being financially sustainable. Maybe that means partnering with the hospital for shared resources or developing preventive care programs or finding grants for rural emergency services. We need to prove our value in ways that go beyond just responding to 911 calls. Victoria nodded thoughtfully, making more notes. And if you had the resources and support to implement those changes, do you think Central Valley could become profitable again? I think Central Valley could become something even better than profitable, I replied. We could become essential. She smiled at that, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. Essential is exactly what we're looking for, Marcus. Essential is what communities like Cedar Falls deserve. As the evening wound down and the restaurant began to empty around us, Victoria gathered her papers and prepared to leave. But before she stood up, she handed me her business card. "I'm staying at the Marriott through Sunday," she said. "Tomorrow I'm touring your facilities and meeting with your management team. But I'd like to continue our conversation, if you're willing. Maybe you could show me around town, help me understand what Central Valley really means to this community." I took the card, still not entirely believing this whole evening had actually happened. "Are you sure that's appropriate? I mean, given the circumstances." "Marcus," she said, standing up and extending her hand again, "appropriate is probably the last word I'd use to describe tonight. But sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected ways." As I watched her walk toward the exit, I realized that everything had changed in the span of a single meal. The woman whose signature could end my career had just asked me to help her understand why it shouldn't. Saturday morning arrived with that crisp autumn air that makes everything feel possible. I barely slept, replaying every moment of the Colinvas previous evening and wondering if I'd dreamed the entire encounter. But Victoria's business card was still sitting on my kitchen counter next to Emma's latest artwork, proof that the most surreal night of my life had actually happened. Emma had returned from her sleepover full of stories about movies and popcorn, and staying up until midnight, completely unaware that her father had potentially altered the course of their future over pasta and conversation. She was now sprawled on the living room floor with her coloring books, humming quietly to herself while she worked on what appeared to be another ambulance drawing. My phone buzzed at exactly 9 o'clock. Victoria's voice sounded different in the daylight, more businesslike, but still carrying that undertone of warmth that had emerged during our dinner conversation. "Good morning, Marcus. I hope I'm not calling too early. I was wondering if that tour offer is still open. I'd like to see Central Valley through your eyes before I make any final decisions." An hour later, I was standing in the parking lot of Central Valley Emergency Services with Victoria Marsh, watching her take in our modest headquarters with the keen eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating medical facilities. Our building wasn't much to look at from the outside. A converted fire station from the 1970s with garage bays for our 3 ambulances and a small office area that had been added onto over the years as our needs expanded. "This is where it all happens," I said, leading her through the main entrance. "Not glamorous, but it's home." Inside, the Saturday morning crew was going through their routine equipment checks. Tony Rodriguez, our most senior medic, was restocking supplies in Unit 2 while his partner Sarah Kim tested the defibrillator. They both looked up as we entered, their expressions shifting from curiosity to barely concealed anxiety when I introduced Victoria. "Miss Marsh wanted to see how we operate," I explained, trying to keep my voice casual. "I thought I'd give her the full tour." Tony, who'd been with Central Valley longer than anyone except our director, stepped forward with the kind of professional courtesy that masked deep concern. "Welcome to our facility, Mom. Always happy to show off our operation." Victoria spent the next hour asking detailed questions about everything from our response protocols to our equipment maintenance schedules. But what struck me was how she listened to the answers. This wasn't the perfunctory fact-gathering I'd expected from a corporate executive. She was genuinely interested in understanding how we functioned as a team, how we made decisions under pressure, how we maintained morale despite the financial uncertainty hanging over everyone's heads. "Tell me about your most challenging calls," she asked Tony as we stood beside Unit 1, our oldest ambulance that had somehow managed to accumulate over 300,000 miles while still running reliably. Tony's face lit up as he launched into a story about a multi-vehicle accident during last winter's blizzard, when visibility was near zero and the roads were sheets of ice. He described how our entire team had worked together for 6 hours, treating victims in conditions that would have challenged much larger services with more resources. "We couldn't transport anyone for the first 3 hours because the roads were impassable," Tony explained. "So we essentially turned the accident scene into a mobile emergency room. Marcus here coordinated triage while Sarah and I provided ongoing care. We saved 4 lives that night, including a 6-year-old girl who went into cardiac arrest." Victoria was taking notes again, but I noticed she was also watching our faces as we told these stories. She seemed to be measuring something that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or performance metrics. After the facility tour, I suggested we drive around town so she could see our service area firsthand. As we traveled the winding roads between Cedar Falls and the rural communities we served, I pointed out landmarks that told the story of our coverage area: the elementary school where we'd responded to 3 separate incidents this year, the senior living facility that relied on us for regular transports, the intersection where we'd saved that teenage overdose victim I'd mentioned the night before. "The nearest hospital is 45 minutes away," I explained as we drove past Miller's farm, where we'd responded to a tractor accident just 2 weeks earlier. "When someone calls 911 out here, we're not just their first responders. We're often their only chance." Victoria was quiet for most of the drive, occasionally asking questions about response times or demographic data, but mostly just observing. When we stopped at Murphy's General Store for coffee, 3 different people approached me to ask about their neighbors, their relatives, people we'd helped over the years. Each conversation reinforced the same theme: in a community this small, emergency medical services weren't just about medical care. We were part of the social fabric that held everything together. "They know you," Victoria observed as we got back in the car. "Not just as a paramedic, but as a person." "That's unusual. Small-town life," I replied. "Everyone knows everyone. It makes the job more personal, but also more rewarding." Our final stop was the community center, where Emma's after-school program was holding their Saturday art class. I'd arranged for my neighbor to pick her up, but I wanted Victoria to see another piece of what Central Valley meant to our community. The center relied on our volunteer coverage for all their events, and we'd responded to everything from playground injuries to elderly participants having medical episodes during exercise classes. As we walked through the center, Emma came running up to me with paint-covered hands and that irrepressible smile that could brighten my worst days. "Daddy, look what I made." She held up a painting that appeared to depict our family dog, though it could have been a horse or possibly a very large cat. "Mrs. Chun said it's going in the art show next week." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, lifting her up for a hug despite the paint situation. "Emma, I'd like you to meet my friend Victoria. She's visiting our town to learn about what we do." Emma studied Victoria with the serious expression that 7-year-olds use when they're trying to determine if a new adult is trustworthy. After a moment, she smiled and offered Victoria her paint-covered hand. "Nice to meet you," Emma said politely. "Do you work with ambulances too?" "In a way," Victoria replied, shaking Emma's hand without any concern for the paint transfer. "Your daddy is showing me around town to help me understand how important his work is." "Oh, it's super important," Emma said with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted this fact. "Daddy saves people every day." But Victoria's business card was still sitting on my kitchen counter next to Emma's latest artwork, proof that the most surreal night of my life had actually happened. Emma had returned from her sleepover full of stories about movies and popcorn, and staying up until midnight, completely unaware that her father had potentially altered the course of their future over pasta and conversation. She was now sprawled on the living room floor with her coloring books, humming quietly to herself while she worked on what appeared to be another ambulance drawing. My phone buzzed at exactly 9 o'clock. Victoria's voice sounded different in the daylight, more businesslike but still carrying that undertone of warmth that had emerged during our dinner conversation. "Good morning, Marcus. I hope I'm not calling too early. I was wondering if that tour offer is still open. I'd like to see Central Valley through your eyes before I make any final decisions." An hour later, I was standing in the parking lot of Central Valley Emergency Services with Victoria Marsh, watching her take in our modest headquarters with the keen eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating medical facilities. Our building wasn't much to look at from the outside. A converted fire station from the 1970s with garage bays for our 3 ambulances and a small office area that had been added onto over the years as our needs expanded. "This is where it all happens," I said, leading her through the main entrance. "Not glamorous, but it's home." Inside, the Saturday morning crew was going through their routine equipment checks. Tony Rodriguez, our most senior medic, was restocking supplies in Unit 2 while his partner Sarah Kim tested the defibrillator. They both looked up as we entered, their expressions shifting from curiosity to barely concealed anxiety when I introduced Victoria. "Miss Marsh wanted to see how we operate," I explained, trying to keep my voice casual. I thought I'd give her the full tour. Tony, who'd been with Central Valley longer than anyone except our director, stepped forward with the kind of professional courtesy that masked deep concern. "Welcome to our facility, Mom. Always happy to show off our operation." Victoria spent the next hour asking detailed questions about everything from our response protocols to our equipment maintenance schedules. But what struck me was how she listened to the answers. This wasn't the perfunctory fact-gathering I'd expected from a corporate executive. She was genuinely interested in understanding how we functioned as a team, how we made decisions under pressure, how we maintained morale despite the financial uncertainty hanging over everyone's heads. "Tell me about your most challenging calls," she asked Tony as we stood beside Unit 1, our oldest ambulance that had somehow managed to accumulate over 300,000 miles while still running reliably. Tony's face lit up as he launched into a story about a multi-vehicle accident during last winter's blizzard, when visibility was near zero and the roads were sheets of ice. He described how our entire team had worked together for 6 hours, treating victims in conditions that would have challenged much larger services with more resources. "We couldn't transport anyone for the first 3 hours because the roads were impassable," Tony explained. "So we essentially turned the accident scene into a mobile emergency room. Marcus here coordinated triage while Sarah and I provided ongoing care. We saved 4 lives that night, including a 6-year-old girl who went into cardiac arrest." Victoria was taking notes again, but I noticed she was also watching our faces as we told these stories. She seemed to be measuring something that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or performance metrics. After the facility tour, I suggested we drive around town so she could see our service area firsthand. As we traveled the winding roads between Cedar Falls and the rural communities we served, I pointed out landmarks that told the story of our coverage area, the elementary school where we'd responded to 3 separate incidents this year, the senior living facility that relied on us for regular transports, the intersection where we'd saved that teenage overdose victim I'd mentioned the night before. "The nearest hospital is 45 minutes away," I explained as we drove past Miller's farm, where we'd responded to a tractor accident just 2 weeks earlier. "When someone calls 911 out here, we're not just their first responders. We're often their only chance." Victoria was quiet for most of the drive, occasionally asking questions about response times or demographic data, but mostly just observing. When we stopped at Murphy's General Store for coffee, 3 different people approached me to ask about their neighbors, their relatives, people we'd helped over the years. Each conversation reinforced the same theme in a community this small. Emergency medical services weren't just about medical care. We were part of the social fabric that held everything together. They know you, Victoria observed as we got back in the car. Not just as a paramedic, but as a person. That's unusual. Small-town life, I replied. Everyone knows everyone. It makes the job more personal, but also more rewarding. Our final stop was the community center, where Emma's after-school program was holding their Saturday art class. I'd arranged for my neighbor to pick her up, but I wanted Victoria to see another piece of what Central Valley meant to our community. The center relied on our volunteer coverage for all their events, and we'd responded to everything from playground injuries to elderly participants having medical episodes during exercise classes. As we walked through the center, Emma came running up to me with paint-covered hands and that irrepressible smile that could brighten my worst days. "Daddy, look what I made." She held up a painting that appeared to depict our family dog, though. It could have been a horse or possibly a very large cat. "Mrs. Chun said it's going in the art show next week." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, lifting her up for a hug despite the paint situation. "Emma, I'd like you to meet my friend Victoria. She's visiting our town to learn about what we do." Emma studied Victoria with the serious expression that 7-year-olds use when they're trying to determine if a new adult is trustworthy. After a moment, she smiled and offered Victoria her paint-covered hand. "Nice to meet you," Emma said politely. "Do you work with ambulances too?" "In a way," Victoria replied, shaking Emma's hand without any concern for the paint transfer. "Your daddy is showing me around town to help me understand how important his work is." "Oh, it's super important," Emma said with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted this fact. "Daddy saves people every day." By evening, all 43 passengers had been treated and transported to appropriate facilities. Miraculously, there were no fatalities, though several injuries were serious enough to require helicopter transport to the trauma center. The incident made regional news, with reporters praising the coordinated response and the seamless integration of multiple emergency services. But what didn't make the news was the conversation Victoria and I had afterward, sitting on the tailgate of my truck, while the sun set over the empty crash site. She looked exhausted, emotionally drained in a way that had nothing to do with corporate stress and everything to do with human compassion. "I'd forgotten," she said quietly, staring at the skid marks still visible on the asphalt. "I'd forgotten what it feels like to be part of something that matters this much. It's different when it's your community," I replied. "When you know the names and faces, when you realize that every call could be your neighbor or your kid's teacher." "I've been thinking about that," Victoria said. "About community, about what it means to serve people instead of just serving shareholders. This partnership was supposed to be about saving Central Valley, but I think it might be saving me too." Something had shifted between us during those hours at the crash site. The professional distance we'd maintained despite our unusual first meeting had dissolved into something more genuine, more personal. We'd moved beyond the roles of CEO and employee into something that felt more like true partnership. Emma noticed the change before I did. A few weeks after the bus accident, she asked me why Victoria always smiled differently when she looked at me now, why her voice got softer when she talked to me during her visits, why she'd started bringing flowers for our kitchen table even though she claimed they were just brightening up the space. "I think Miss Victoria likes you, Daddy," Emma announced one evening while we were making dinner together. "Like really likes you, the way Tommy's mom likes his dad." I nearly dropped the pasta I was draining. "Emma, that's not... We're just friends. She's helping our company, that's all." "Hung," Emma said with the knowing expression that 8-year-olds use when they're absolutely certain adults are being dense about obvious things. That's why she knows how I like my pancakes and why she remembers that I don't like green vegetables except for peas, and why she brought me that book about horses even though you never told her I liked horses. Out of the mouths of babes, Victoria had indeed been paying attention to details that went far beyond professional courtesy. She knew Emma's favorite bedtime stories, remembered which days she had soccer practice, and had somehow intuited that the reason I always looked tired on Thursday mornings was because Emma had nightmares on Wednesday nights and usually ended up sleeping in my bed. The realization that Victoria's interest in our lives might extend beyond the Central Valley partnership was both thrilling and terrifying. Dating hadn't been on my radar since Emma's mother left, partly because of the practical challenges of single parenthood and partly because I'd built walls around my heart that felt safer than risking that kind of vulnerability again. But Victoria was different. She'd seen me at my most professional during emergency calls and at my most personal during quiet family moments. She'd proven herself during the bus incident, showing the kind of character that couldn't be faked or manufactured. And somehow, despite the corporate boardrooms and business suits, she fit into our small-town life with an ease that surprised everyone, including herself. The turning point came during Emma's school play in late October. Victoria had mentioned during one of her visits that she'd never been to an elementary school production, so Emma had insisted on inviting her to see The Three Little Pigs, where Emma was playing the role of the second pig with an enthusiasm that far exceeded her actual acting ability. Watching Victoria laugh at Emma's dramatic interpretation of pig-related dialogue, seeing her applaud with genuine pride when Emma took her bow, observing the way she naturally joined the other parents for post-show refreshments without any of the awkwardness I'd expected, I realized that something fundamental had changed in all our lives. This wasn't just about saving Central Valley anymore. This wasn't just about corporate partnerships or financial stability or professional advancement. This was about family, about finding people who choose to love you not despite your circumstances but because of who you are when those circumstances reveal your true character. As we walked Emma to the car after the play, Victoria slipped her hand into mine with a naturalness that felt like coming home. Emma, walking ahead of us and still buzzing with post-performance excitement, turned back and grinned. "See, Daddy? I told you she really liked you." And for the first time in years, the future felt not just secure, but genuinely bright. 18 months later, I was standing in the emergency bay of our newly expanded Central Valley headquarters, watching Emma carefully arrange white roses in mason jars while Victoria directed the setup crew with the organizational skills that had made her one of the most respected executives in healthcare. Today wasn't just any day at Central Valley Emergency Services. Today was the day we were celebrating something that no one could have predicted when this whole journey began. The transformation had been extraordinary. What started as a desperate attempt to save a failing rural ambulance service had evolved into something unprecedented in the industry. Central Valley had become the flagship model for Apex Medical Solutions' community integration program, proving that corporate resources and small-town values could not only coexist, but actually enhance each other in ways that benefited everyone involved. Our fleet had grown from 3 aging ambulances to 8 state-of-the-art vehicles. Our staff had expanded from 12 to 35, including specialists in community health, emergency management, and preventive care. We now served 6 rural communities across 2 counties, providing not just emergency response, but comprehensive medical support that had reduced hospital readmission rates by 40% and emergency room visits by 25%. But the real success story wasn't in the statistics or the financial reports. It was in the relationships we'd built, the lives we'd touched, and the way a small town in Montana had taught a Fortune 500 company what healthcare could look like when it prioritized people over profits. Victoria had relocated permanently to Cedar Falls 8 months ago, initially claiming it was to oversee the integration process more effectively. But everyone knew the real reason she'd traded her corner office in Chicago for a converted farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Love has a way of redefining priorities, and watching her discover the joys of small-town life had been one of the most beautiful transformations I'd ever witnessed. She'd learned to appreciate the rhythm of rural living, the way neighbors looked out for each other without being asked, the satisfaction that came from knowing your work directly impacted people you cared about. Emma had been her enthusiastic guide through this cultural adjustment, teaching her everything from the proper way to wave at farmers on their tractors to the unwritten rules of potluck dinner contributions. The secret, Emma had explained seriously, during one of their cooking lessons, is to always bring something homemade. But it doesn't have to be fancy. Mrs. Rodriguez brings the same bean salad to everything, and everyone loves it because she makes it with love. Victoria had taken this advice to heart, developing a reputation for her surprisingly excellent cornbread that had become a requested item at community gatherings. Watching a woman who'd once commanded boardrooms learn to navigate church social committees had been endlessly entertaining, but also deeply moving. We now offered wellness checks for elderly residents, health screenings at community events, and educational programs that had significantly reduced preventable emergencies. It was the kind of innovative approach that other companies were studying and attempting to replicate in their own service areas. "Marcus," Victoria called from across the room, where she was reviewing seating arrangements with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to corporate mergers. "Your sister just arrived with the kids. Emma's about to lose her mind with excitement." Sarah had made the trip from Portland with her husband and their 2 children, who Emma had been counting down the days to see. The reunion was everything I'd hoped for, with cousins who'd only known each other through video calls finally getting to play together in person. Watching Emma show off her town, her friends, and especially her soon-to-be stepmother filled me with a contentment I'd never imagined possible. The ceremony itself was held in the equipment bay of our headquarters, surrounded by the ambulances that had quite literally brought Victoria and me together. Asterisk. Emma walked down the makeshift aisle scattering rose petals with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested a promising future in theater, while Tony Rodriguez served as my best man and Victoria's daughter Jessica had flown in from Seattle to stand as her maid of honor. Judge Morrison, who'd known me since I was Emma's age, officiated with a warmth that made the legal proceedings feel like a family gathering. His words about love, commitment, and building something stronger together than either person could create alone resonated beyond just our personal relationship to encompass everything we'd accomplished with Central Valley. When he pronounced us husband and wife, the cheer that went up from our assembled guests included not just family and friends, but patients we'd served, community leaders who'd supported our expansion, and apex executives who'd traveled from across the country to witness what they were already calling the most successful integration in company history. The reception that followed was pure Cedar Falls, a potluck dinner featuring Mrs. Rodriguez's famous bean salad, live music from the high school jazz band, and dancing in the parking lot under string lights that Emma had insisted were absolutely essential for proper wedding ambiance. Victoria's corporate colleagues found themselves square dancing with local farmers, sharing stories and discovering that the distance between their worlds was much smaller than any of them had realized. Danny Morrison, who'd been our most vocal skeptic during the early days of the partnership, approached Victoria during the father-daughter dance that had become an impromptu family dance involving Emma, me, and my new wife. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "I thought you were here to destroy what we'd built, but you've made it stronger than I ever imagined possible." Victoria's response was characteristically gracious. "You were protecting something precious. Danny, that kind of loyalty is exactly what makes this community special." And it's what convinced me that Central Valley was worth saving. As the evening wound down and our guests began to drift home, Victoria and I found ourselves alone in the equipment bay where we just pledged our lives to each other. Emma had fallen asleep in Jessica's arms, exhausted from a day that had exceeded even her considerable expectations for excitement and celebration. "So," Victoria said, settling into my arms as we swayed to music from the radio, "how does it feel to be married to a corporate executive?" "I don't know," I replied, spinning her gently under the fluorescent lights that suddenly seemed as romantic as any ballroom. "How does it feel to be married to a small-town paramedic?" "Like coming home," she answered without hesitation. "Like finding something I didn't even know I was looking for." 6 months after our wedding, Central Valley Emergency Services received the National Rural Healthcare Excellence Award, recognizing our innovative approach to community-integrated emergency medicine. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., and Victoria, Emma, and I traveled there together as a family, something that still felt wonderfully surreal every time I thought about it. But the real measure of our success wasn't in awards or recognition. It was in the fact that Mrs. Patterson now called Victoria granddaughter and expected weekly visits. It was in Emma's confidence that she lived in a place where people took care of each other, where her father's work mattered, and where her new mother had chosen their family and their community over everything else she could have had. It was in the knowledge that what had started as a chance encounter in a restaurant had grown into something that touched hundreds of lives, created dozens of jobs, and proved that the best business decisions are often the ones that prioritize human connection over pure profit. Last week, Emma came home from school with news that her friend Dylan had decided he wanted to be a paramedic when he grew up, inspired by a career day presentation I'd given to her class. Victoria was there when Emma shared this story, and I watched her face light up with the same pride I felt whenever our work inspired the next generation of caregivers. "That's how you know you're making a difference," Victoria said later, as we tucked Emma into bed and listened to her prayers that always included gratitude for her family, her friends, and all the people Daddy and Mama Victoria help every day. Standing there in our daughter's doorway, looking at the life we'd built together against all odds, I realized that some stories don't have endings as much as they have new beginnings. Every day brought new calls, new challenges, new opportunities to serve our community and each other. Every day reinforced the truth that the most important saves aren't always the dramatic rescues that make headlines. Sometimes the most important saves happen quietly, in small moments of connection that ripple outward in ways you never expect. Sometimes they happen when two people from completely different worlds discover they share the same values, the same commitment to service, the same belief that taking care of each other is what makes us human. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they happen when a single dad paramedic saves a choking CEO in a small-town restaurant, and they both discover that the best rescues are the ones where everyone gets saved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.